Hello, my name is CaryJensen, and welcome to FireDAC Skills Sprints. Today's session is Preprocessing SQL Commands with FireDAC. Here's the topics I'm covering today. I'm going to begin with an overview of what SQL preprocessing means. Then we'll talk about flexible SQL without the FireDAC preprocessor. I'll show you how to enable SQL preprocessing. And then we'll discuss the various types of SQL preprocessing, including variable substitution, macro expansion, and conditional substitution. I'll conclude with a look at special character processing. SQL, the structured query language, is an industry-standard language for executing data definition language statements and data manipulation language statements against relational database servers such as InterBase, Oracle, and Microsoft SQL Server. FireDAC's SQL preprocessor is a mechanism that examines your SQL statements and, under the right conditions, replaces text within those statements before passing the SQL to the underlying database. FireDAC's SQL preprocessor provides you with great flexibility in defining your SQL statements and provides you with a convenient mechanism for accommodating the idiosyncratic differences between SQL Server dialects. Without the FireDAC preprocessor, you do have flexibility in your SQL, and this is normally provided for in the where predicates of your SQL statements through parameters. Parameters are variable-like symbols against which you can compare fields and expressions. This example query here has a parameter called comp, so we're comparing a company name to some value. This is an example of a named parameter. Some SQL servers support unnamed parameters, which use a special character, for example, the question mark. Before you can execute a SQL statement that includes one or more parameters, you must bind a valid value to that parameter. Let's go over to Delphi and take a look at an example of a parameterized query. Here's a simple project that has a data module. And on that data module, we'll find a SQL connection and a query. This connection points to the DBDemos database supported by InterBase, and it's using an InterBase driver, FireDAC InterBase driver. This FireDAC query employs a parameterized query. We can say we can see right here that it has a single parameter called comp, and we're selecting all fields from the customer table where the company field contains the value that we assign to this parameter. Again, that assignment must be made prior to execution. Now, FireDAC's query editor can examine and sees that that's a particular parameter, and we could even define a value for this at design time. So if we put in a value such as UNESCO and execute that query, UNESCO will be provided as the company name and compared in the SQL predicate clause here. Company equals, in this case, UNESCO. You'll see that that's the kind of value that we're returning here. From our main form, we have a field called company edit, and we can type in a value. And then when I click this button, we bind the value in that edit to the value of the parameter. In this case, I'm using param by name, but you can use params with its zero-based index in square braces. And then after we've bound the parameter, we're going to call open. Let me go ahead and run this example and show you. So right here, we can type in UNESCO, and I'll click the button, and we load the result. Now, there's one other aspect of using parameters that's very, very important. It's much better than if we had simply taken the value here and concatenated it to a string that says select all from company or from customer, where company equals this value. And the reason why this is important is it prevents a particular hack called the SQL injection hack. For example, if we were binding these values directly into the query without using a parameter, it would be possible for someone to type in something like this. Assuming that the semicolon is a SQL statement separator, they could then follow up with something like this, which could be disastrous for our database. However, with a SQL parameter, the drop table statement is not being interpreted as part of the SQL, but is actually part of the search value. And in this case, there's no company whose name is a semicolon drop table customer semicolon. So parameters provide us with that additional bit of protection. To enable SQL preprocessing in FireDAC, we need to set macro create and macro expand to true. These are, in fact, the default values. So we really don't have to do anything special initially in order to enable SQL preprocessing. Let's begin with the first type of SQL preprocessing. This is called variable substitution. Variable substitution permits you to embed variables in your SQL statements, even in those places where traditional SQL parameters are not allowed. For example, you could put a variable in the select portion or even in the from portion of a select statement so that the table you're selecting from could be defined at runtime. Simply put a variable in place of the table name, and then you can assign a value to that variable prior to executing the SQL statement. Variables in your SQL are identified by the AND character, which you follow with the variable name. The named variables appear in the macros collection property of the associated FireDAC dataset after you've defined the SQL statement that includes variable substitution. Let's take a look at a very simple project that makes use of variable substitution. This happens to be a FMX project. We have a data module here. The data module has a FireDAC connection that once again uses the FireDAC InterBase driver to connect to the DBDemos database. There's a query that gets a list of the tables in the DBDemos database, and that makes use of this InterBase system select statement. And if we execute this, you'll see it actually comes up with the various tables that are found in this particular connected database. I have another query. In this one, this query here makes use of a variable substitution. The variable name is table name, and as you can see, the AND character identifies that character. If we click over to macros, you can see that it has identified that variable name. And here I can put in the value of the customer name field. If you go back to the SQL, you'll see I'm actually not selecting any records at all. The purpose of this query, in fact, is to produce metadata. In other words, I want to get the field names that are available in this particular table. So what that means, this query gets all my table names, this table gets my field names. And when we run this application, you're going to see that we have tables selected in one, or tables that we can select in one column. And when I select a column in that, or a particular table name, I can see the fields. And this is a multi-select list box, so I can select two or more fields. And then I can show the data. Now that show data query makes use of, just like the query that gets the field metadata, this query makes use of variable substitution. If we come over to this query, we'll see that there's two parts to it. Select in a variable from a variable. Those macros are listed here. And here you'll notice that my field list is company and my table name is customer. Those are just values I've entered in while testing my query. And we can see that those values are substituted into that query. Over on my main form here, I have a button that I can click. And it ensures that I have something selected as a field name, at least one field name selected. And if I do, then I load my data. Here's the load data function, and it has a local procedure that it uses to build up my field list. And what this procedure does is I build the field list by calling by calling build list repeatedly once for each field that's selected. If there's no field selected, I just simply create the original value of the field list. If there's already a field list in there, then it adds a comma and a space so that I get a properly formed select statement in my field list variable. Finally, I take that field list variable and I bind it to the first macro, which is my macro for the field names, and I take the selected table name and I bind that to the second macro, which is my table name variable, and that then when I open the query, I get the result. And that is how that particular project was run. Notice over in my database, I have a remote client link monitor so that I can use the FireDAC monitor to monitor. You'll learn more about this next week in the FireDAC skill sprints. So I won't go into too much details other than to say that you'll notice down in my configuration that I'm specifying the remote monitor and I'm turning tracing on my connection interface. So that is how that makes all of that is working. I'm going to now run my my project. Okay, let's go ahead and select company or the customer table and a couple fields here. And let's clear and now show. And we're going to see something interesting here. First of all, we will see that in a preparation, we see the select statement with our variables that are used in substitution. But subsequently, we are going to get a definition that is modified. We'll actually see that following the pre-processing, that we actually have the field name. So we have, there is our original, and there is what happens after the pre-processing. So the FireDAC monitor can be very helpful in letting you peer in and see the kind of changes we're making. Okay, let's go ahead and close this application. Go ahead and say, macro expansion permits you to include special escape sequences that are automatically replaced with syntax correct SQL based on the server to which you are connected. Macros appear within a pair of curly braces, and macro expansion occurs when resource options.escape expand is set to true, which is its default value. FireDAC supports three types of macro expansion: constant substitution, identifier substitution, and scalar functions. With constant substitution, you have within your curly braces a single character that identifies the type of constant you're referring to, followed by the constant value. And what FireDAC will do is ensure that for the particular database you're connected to, that value is properly formatted. Identifier substitution permits you to instruct FireDAC to replace the macro with a properly delimited field or table name. In this case, if we had a field called order date with a space in between, using this identifier substitution, FireDAC will properly delimit order date. For instance, in Oracle, it would include order date within double quotes. FireDAC supports a very large number of scalar functions, and you can include those scalar function invocations within the curly braces. Let's go over back to Delphi, and I have the help system up. This is for the for our evaluation of constant values. So we can see E is used for numbers, D for date, T for times, DT for date times, L for booleans, and S for strings. And so we can put our literal values in, and FireDAC will ensure that it's formatted correctly for that particular server to which you're connected. I talked about scalar functions. There's a large number of scalar functions, and this page of the help system can show you what those scalar functions are. So you see here's a large number of character macro functions, numeric macro functions, date time functions, and system macro functions, as well as conversion macro functions for converting values. Coming down here, we can see the definition of the ID definition. And I have not included in my code sample an example of this because I don't have any fields in the dbdemos database that have spaces. And if I use this identifier substitution macro on a field with no spaces, it did not interpret it correctly. In any case, let's go back to Delphi and take a look at these various macros. So here I have a connection and a FireDAC query. I also have a remote client link monitor that's also set up only to examine prepare statements. And if you look at my SQL here, you'll see that I include variable substitution, our FireDAC functions, and here's a FireDAC function as well, and here is the constant macro. Okay, so let's go ahead. Let's ensure that our FireDAC monitor is running. Let's now run the project. I don't have to be running with the debugger. Okay, excellent. If we notice here is our statement that includes the original macros and variables for variable substitution and our constant substitution macro. Then here we see that the constant substitution has been replaced with a cast statement that ensures that 1988 is a numeric value. And our prior extract statement has now been correctly converted to an extract year from statement. It's modified that statement as well. And it's placed the InterBase current date function in place of our current date macro. So that demonstrates the macro expansion. Conditional substitution allows you to specify parts of the statement that you want to execute against the database server based on which database server you're connected to. And this can be very valuable when you have applications that you've written that have to support 2 or more database servers. Conditional substitution is useful when the SQL preprocessor cannot determine what SQL to commit, such as when the name of a field in a select statement depends on which database you're connected to. Conditional substitution necessarily involves 1 or more database identifiers. Here's an example of a statement where we're saying that if we're actually going to select from 2 fields, order ID and some order date field. If we're connected to MS SQL Server, then the string order date will appear. If we're connected to InterBase, ord date is the field name. And those 2 fields will be selected from the orders table. It's possible to include 1 more value than your database identifiers, and if you do, that their third identifier, so we have order date, ord date, and o date, that third identifier will be used if the currently connected database does not match any of the provided database identifiers. If the database does match one of the database identifiers, then the first database identifier is associated with the first field. The second database identifier is associated with the second. You can also do a simple if statement. So it says here, if we're connected to InterBase, then we're going to also query the ord date field from the orders table. Going back over to the help system, if I scroll to the bottom of this page, I can see the various database identifiers that are provided by FireDAC for the supported database drivers. This is the list of database drivers as of RAD Studio XE7. Special character processing is necessary when one of the characters you are using matches one of the escape sequence characters, either the AND character or curly brace. When you need to pass one of these special characters to the underlying database and not have it interpreted as an escape sequence, you include the special character twice. For example, you can include 2 consecutive curly braces to avoid having the processor interpret the opening curly brace as the beginning of a scalar function. There are some special cases for certain versions of databases, and you'll want to refer to the help system for that And this is appearing at the very bottom of this page, and it points out that there's certain special cases that you may want to consider, and this is in the preprocessor command text page of the help system. Well, I'm looking forward to your questions coming up at the conclusion of this talk. In the meantime, let me point out that you can download these example database applications that I've created for you from www.jensendatasystems.com/dynamicsql.zip. That also gives you that slideshow. I want to point out that this spring, Ray Konopka and I are visiting 4 cities in the US, Scandinavia, and Europe. And this is our annual Delphi Developer Days tour, a 2 days of intense Delphi material presented by Ray and I. If you attend, you receive the Delphi Developer Days book. It's about 400 pages in length, and it has all the details for all the talks that we present. Some of our presentations are joint presentations where we both present, and sometimes we break out into separate rooms. The book ensures that when we have our breakout sessions that you do have the material for all the talks. I also want to mention that I have released a second edition of my Delphi In-Depth Client Datasets book. You can read more about that book at www.jensendatasystems.com/cdsbook. On that page, you'll also find links for ordering the book. If you need to contact me, here's my email address. My company website is jensendatasystems.com. I ask you to follow me on my blog at CaryJensen.blogspot.com and follow me on Twitter. It's at CaryJensen or twitter.com/CaryJensen. Thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Bjarne was asking, how would you upscale the customer demo to a DataSnap application or multi-tier application when you want to do this kind of pre-processing of SQL statements to access customers and so on? Do you have some advice for Bjarne how to separate the pieces apart?
Yeah, it's not terribly difficult. And another part of this question relates to, do you still use data-aware controls? And the answer, let me answer that because I didn't answer it in my written response, which is yes, you still use data-aware controls. And so the mechanism for this is that in your DataSnap server, in your server methods class, you have a special class that you hang off all the methods that you want to be able to access from the client. You'll expose particular functions that return data from your database that is being accessed by the DataSnap server, or you're using a dataset provider and client dataset combination where the dataset provider resides on the server and the client dataset is in the DataSnap client, and return the data packet for the client dataset from the server. You do use data-aware controls in the client, but those data-aware controls are not connecting to, they're not using a, for instance, with FireDAC, an FD connection and an FD query or an FD connection and FD stored proc pattern. Instead, the client dataset is using some DataSnap client-side controls to communicate with the DataSnap server to obtain the data. Once the data is in the client dataset, you use data-aware controls either through live bindings or VCL data-aware controls to present the data to the user. Now, that just makes life easier. You can actually use other types of controls, and then from the client dataset, you just populate those controls. But then you have to take responsibility for noting if the user has changed anything so that you know whether to write back or not. If you're using client datasets and data-aware controls or live bindings, you simply look at the client dataset's change count, or if you're using a FireDAC table, you look at the updates pending property, and then that gives you, that tells you if there's any changes in the client dataset or the FDMMTable. Now, again, this data is all being cached on the client, but when the user is done with their editing, you will either call apply updates on the client dataset, or you will call a server-side method that will receive the updates from your client, and then the server is responsible for writing the data down to the underlying database. So it's actually DataSnap makes this process really quite straightforward. But part of his question was, do we still use data work controls on the client? And the answer is yes. There was also a follow-up question that does this kind of stuff all work on mobile devices? And the answer to that is yes. FireDAC is fully cross-platform. The FireDAC components compile for all 6 of Red Studio's compilers. So whether your client is a DataSnap client or you're just having a standalone mobile application, this preprocessing capability and all the other FireDAC capabilities that have been covered in this FireDAC Skill Sprints series are available on the mobile client.
There was one other aspect that I'll read in between how to move maybe to multi-tier. You showed examples of parameterized queries, and if the client application, someone may be typing in the name of a customer or whatever, they would have to then send that data through a method, for example, call to the DataSnap server, which could then have the code to associate that value with the parameterized query, right, and then fire the query off to get the right data back to the client, right?
That's correct. And if you're using a client data set on the client, all you need to do is, of course, the client data set is communicating with a dataset provider on the DataSnap server. You actually have a params property in the client dataset, and you can bind the parameters to the client dataset, and then when you call open on the client dataset, it actually passes those parameters to the dataset provider on the server, and the dataset provider, without you adding any code, binds those parameters to the underlying query or stored procedure. And this is true whether we're using FireDAC or any of the other data access frameworks supported by Red Studio. So it actually can be really quite simple to build a multi-tier applications. Client dataset currently is the component that does this very easily. I'm hoping that as FireDAC matures and gets more DataSnap aware, that we're actually going to be able to use the FireDAC to do essentially those same types of operations of query binding on the client and then having the framework itself take responsibility for passing those parameters to the DataSnap server and producing the necessary bindings on the server so that the data entered by the user, say they enter in a customer number, that when you open the FDMMTable, you get all records associated with that particular customer in the client. But yeah, that's part of the DataSnap framework itself.
And everyone should check out in the doc wiki as well the FD schema adapter, which was added to be able to do more flexible operations with things like master detail, where you can get the schema sent over along with the data, and then associate that with FDMMTables. Yeah.
That's right. The FD schema adapter received a pretty major upgrade in XE7. It is very heavyweight, though. It's nowhere near the lightweight communication that the client dataset offers these days. If you look at what the schema adapter is passing back and forth, you might as well just stream the entire dataset and just pass that whole thing, including its change cache. It's it's a big chunk of data that's being passed.
It's probably better meant for network-based applications than mobile-based applications, for example. Yeah. There was a question here, is the pre-processing specific for FireDAC, or is it available also in DB Express?
It is most definitely a FireDAC feature.
Now the parameterized part, you can have parameter substitutions in DB Express as well, but all of the rest of the things you showed with conditional ifs and so on, that's all FireDAC, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And FireDAC is the way to go. I always remind everybody, time to move to FireDAC as you can, of course. It's your time schedule and your project schedules, but we're putting all of our effort into FireDAC. DB Express is as it is and will stay as it is. We'll do little maintenance things if we find them, but FireDAC is getting all the engineering work and all the attention now and into the future. It is the cross-platform. It'll be the technology that when we get to Linux server targeting of server-type applications like DataSnap servers, EMS servers, REST servers, web servers, and so on, FireDAC will be that that database access that'll work across all the current platforms and platforms into the future. Let's see. Yeah, I think Alf was saying he's got 120 stored procedure calls that he needs to move over to FireDAC. I mean, it's a stored procedure call, right? Whether it's DB Express or it's FireDAC, right? Cary, do you have any other advice?
Well, what my comment of, or my reply to him was that that's actually makes things very, very simple, because your functionality is in the stored procedure. So you're basically just replacing a DB Express SQL dataset with a FireDAC stored proc component or a FireDAC query component. Yes, you have to use that component and bind parameters if the stored procedure takes parameters, but it's actually quite a bit easier, given that the FireDAC query or stored proc component, it will return a result set that's editable, whereas the DB Express the SQL dataset component is a unidirectional and read-only result set that has to be transferred into a client dataset before you can edit it. So FireDAC makes life much, much easier in terms of working with the results of a stored procedure call. Again, I love stored procedures, and because I can, all that functionality is in the database with your data and with a database engine that's designed to manipulate and extract data in a most efficient fashion, rather than having a bunch of logic rolling around in your client applications. So yeah, if it's in stored procs, it's going to be a nice, easy conversion. I want to point out one additional thing about FireDAC is I'm a database developer, and I know that the process of switching from one data access framework to another is not something you undertake lightly. But FireDAC has enough interesting features that you can layer FireDAC in gradually into your application. For instance, you may start by adding some FireDAC components to use the local SQL capability, even though the rest of your data access components are DB Express or one of the, it's a ADO or one of the other data access mechanisms. FireDAC can perform local queries on any data set. So you might start by using some of those neat FireDAC features, and then as time permits, start pulling out the other data access mechanisms, connection components and dataset components, and replacing them with FireDAC. But again, that's something that when the resources are available, you would do. But you could start using FireDAC right away in conjunction with one of your other data access mechanisms.
Bjorn is mentioning he would love to see samples using larger databases, and he gave me one. I have it. I downloaded it from our FTP server. It's got 1 million rows. It's in I think it's in a Firebird database, if I remember correctly. But in any case, I put in a comment, Cary, and maybe you want to talk a little more too about if you want to do table-based operations, FireDAC has a live data window capability. I put the link to the doc wiki there, where you can move a window around in a large table versus doing SQL selects to limit the number of rows you're seeing at a time. And then DataSnap, you can throttle how many rows are sent over in chunks in addition. But any other thoughts about large database processing?
Right. You really hit it right on the head, David. The live data window for the FireDAC table component has it's configurable how large the live data window is. It has some interesting limitations, however, but for just having 50 million records out there on the server and then opening up a FireDAC table, you're not going to get all those records attempted to pull down to your client. You just get the local number of records, like 50 or something like that, or 80 or 100. You can change that configuration. With DataSnap and using client datasets, which still is the kind of the model, you have to set packet, I think it's called packet records, to the number of records you want, and then you put some event handlers in to pass to the server saying, okay, this is the highest level value, gave me that last time. Now use that in the query as a parameter to pull the next 50 records over and the next 50 over. It's a bit of work, but certainly DataSnap is very, very capable of in in working with very large data sets, because we definitely don't want to bring down an enormous number of records to the client. That's not feasible.
And then Bjorn follows up. He says it's not LDW is not usable if you start changing between the indexes and doing locate methods and so on. And there is a filter property and a filtered property where you can set a filter for the rows inside of the data window. But if you start doing those kinds of things, I'm almost thinking you should be using an FD query. I don't know what you think, Cary.
I would agree. You definitely need to take into account what you're trying to do on the client. And again, we're talking about the DataSnap multi-tier client and server running in different processes on different machines. You need to take into account what your application needs to do, and then choose the appropriate technology. Fortunately, the FireDAC help is extensive, and it does have some information about the live data window and situations where you may have to take additional steps in order to ensure that you're getting the data that you want.
The other thing I was suggesting besides those is, depending on what he's doing, he might think about creating views of data on that SQL database site itself and then switching between different views to get the things that he wants based on different indexing or different selection sets and so on. There's lots of different database tricks, but in any way, let's see how Alp was saying maybe a skill sprint in the future on stored procs. Okay, probably be a good one to show rapid SQL ability to do stored procedure debugging on certain backend databases. That might be cool as well. I've always wanted to play with that some more. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Dimitri has made this comment. I'm going to just put this in. There are 1,001 ways to make LDW fail due to concept. There's no sense and no ability to make client sorting to be synchronized when the server-side sorting collation in all cases. So there's always going to be something, depending on what you're doing. I tend to want to use SQL queries, parameterized queries all the time. That's just me. And again, views might be another approach to let the database do more of the work, but that's just my thinking.
I agree also. Not everyone loves SQL. I find myself relying very heavily on SQL. And as a database developer, SQL is the language. Yes, there are no SQL-type databases, but the primary databases that businesses are using these days are SQL servers, and SQL is the language. And anyone who is using databases and the SQL databases and hasn't yet really explored SQL, I can promise you that as you get into it, you're going to be extraordinarily pleased with the richness of the syntax and the capabilities. Structured query language, the structure part of the structured query language is the ability to include subqueries, both in where predicates, in your linking, and even in the select statement. You can have a select statement where every element isn't a field but is in fact a subquery. It's a very expressive language and very, very powerful. And you're telling the database server to do that work for you, and that's how you want to separate the responsibilities in the databases. Have the database do the things it excels at, and have your client application do the things that it excels at, and that is displaying a user interface so that the user can interact with the data.
Yep, and yeah, select in a where clause, absolutely. There was let's see why I answered it, and then David said, could we point him to a good sample where an update insert query is being used with FireMonkey Edit combo box, and I just said I'll look for an example. I mean, I could probably just create one and do a blog post. But it's easy to hook the combo box, on item select. I think that's what it's called, and then get the selected text from the combo box. Set that parameter in your FD query for the parameter, for example, like customer name or customer ID or whatever, and then just execute the query. So I don't see any do either, whether it's an update or an insert or select or delete. Doesn't really.
I have some examples, and I'm doing some things not exactly like that, but I'm doing a DataSnap and REST talk in Delphi Developer Days. So one of my breakout sessions is focusing on REST and DataSnap, and I'm using both client dataset examples and the FireDAC Mentable examples using the FireDAC JSON Reflect. That's a work in process. That is, FireDAC JSON Reflect has some limitations, especially when it comes to master detail relationships. But I don't know. Maybe this would be a good topic for a skill sprint at some time.
Yep. And there's a question here about should they be using ClientDataSet or FDMMTable? And I've said FDMMTable is the future. ClientDataSet's still going to be around for a long time, but it's not being phased out in a sense. It's just it does what it does. It's got its feature set. We're not adding any features specifically to ClientDataSet. Cary's got a whole book on it. It's in fact the second edition. So get the book and go to his past Code Rage sessions where he's done just about, I think, everything you can do to ClientDataSet, I believe, right, Cary? And I think the second edition of your book is the definitive, that's the ClientDataSet, right?
Yes, the FDMMTable is the future, but it's not feature complete if you compare it to ClientDataSet and how the ClientDataSet functions, especially in distributed applications. So ironically, I am also doing a breakout session at Delphi Developer Days that is a comparison of ClientDataSet and FDMMTable. And the FDMMTable is very, very powerful and has a lot of features to it, but you can't simply take all your client data sets out of your application and replace them with FDMMTables today. I anticipate someday down the road, maybe a couple years from now, that will be possible. But the FDMMTable does not support all the features that ClientDataSet does at this point. So you're just not simply going to replace all your client datasets. The nice thing, though, is that both client datasets and FDMMTables are completely cross-platform. They can be used in any of the with any of the compilers. And then once the FDMMTable gets this collection of features, especially features like where the client dataset, you perform an open on a client dataset in a DataSnap client, and it extracts data from your DataSnap server, and then once the client dataset has been changed, you call apply updates. That is what the client dataset was originally designed for. The FDMMTable can't do that yet without a lot of additional code. It can be done, and I do demonstrate that in my my DataSnap and REST talk. But it takes a fair amount of code to make sure that it all happens correctly.
Okay, and Peter says, bought your second edition recently. I will have to get you to sign that one as well at your next London Delphi Developer Days.
We're not going to be in London this year, okay. But when you see that I'm going to be at an event and you're going to be there, definitely bring your book along. I'd be happy to sign it.
Amsterdam is close.
Amsterdam is close, yes, and we have a really nice venue in Amsterdam this year. It's at Schiphol Airport, but it has a bus that goes back to the airport I think it's every 20 minutes. You can be in central Amsterdam from that hotel in less than half an hour, and it's a beautiful venue. This hotel has beautiful conference rooms, so anywhere in the world you can get to Schiphol Airport. I think it's the third largest airport in Europe. And then you're just minutes away from the hotel, and you can visit with all the other Delphi Developer Days attendees. It's always great fun.
Let me put a shout out, and I reply to Stephen Ball's message. Next Tuesday, Stephen is doing an InterBase change views skill sprint on the next Tuesday. He's going to be talking about how to use FireDAC, a future a next generation or next version of Rad Studio support that FireDAC is adding for change views. So even though it's not in the FireDAC skill sprints, it is going to cover FireDAC as well. So everyone who's on this should join us next Tuesday, and you'll not only learn about InterBase XZ7's change views and all the great stuff you can do for high performance database operations, subscribing to changes that take place in the database, as opposed to selecting, based on some columns or whatever. And that Stephen is going to preview FireDAC support for change views. So don't miss next Tuesday.
I'm not going to miss it. This sounds fantastic. I'm very much looking forward to seeing this. The new change views in InterBase XE7 sound like a tremendous feature. And to be able to see how FireDAC is going to be able to leverage that, I'm going to definitely be watching that skill sprints.
Yeah, and then Peter just says, "Okay, see you in Amsterdam then." So there you go. Bjarne is saying, by the way, Cary, you could use the FD meta database components to get table names, field names, but you knew that already. Yeah, there's whole metadata support in FireDAC as well. Yep. In fact, here I'll put the link. Here's the page for everybody else on the doc wiki for FireDAC for metadata, working with metadata in FireDAC. I put that URL along on Bjarne's comment. So
yeah, I appreciate that comment, because that would make that particular example completely cross-platform. The way I wrote it, I used a specific SQL that would only work against InterBase. So that's a great comment. Thanks, Bjarne.
There's one. Oh, just Kai is saying, seems like FireDAC preprocessing will solve many of my database jobs. Thanks for your effort already. Great. Vladislav asked, does FireDAC support Postgres? And the answer is yes. I think all the databases, you had a list in your presentation of all the databases that we support, and FireDAC works with all of those, and also FireDAC works with Delphi and C++ Builder. So
and it also compiles under all the compilers, so it's a cross-platform data access framework. And for any database that doesn't have a direct, most of those drivers that I showed when discussing the conditional expansion, most of those drivers are native drivers written in Pascal, and you can actually examine those drivers, and it's really nice that they're written in Pascal. Some of the drivers are called bridging drivers, that they actually bridge over to something else. And for instance, the Microsoft Access driver, of which there is a question that we'll address in just a minute or two here, is one of those bridging drivers. There's also an ODBC driver, which is a bridging driver. So as long as you have an ODBC driver for your database, you can access it through FireDAC, which means basically there's almost no database that is a mainstream relational SQL-based database that you cannot touch with FireDAC.
Yep. Let's see. Oh, here's one I didn't know the answer. So, and you sort of replied, does the expansion capability? And I'm thinking maybe he's talking more about the conditional part versus the, with the parameter part, you write code and you can do whatever you want to store the value of a parameter in the params array. But Robert is saying, does the expansion capability allow selections using wildcards? So I guess you're saying you don't quite understand the question.
Yeah, because, well, it really depends on where we're talking about. There is, with the FireDAC functions, they're going to expand appropriately for the underlying database to which FireDAC is connected, to which your FD connection is using. So there's no wildcards there. And so, yeah, I didn't entirely understand the question, Robert, about the wildcard part. And certainly, your variable substitution could include wildcards wherever you would have a wildcard in a SQL statement. So if you're doing a select these fields from this table where this field is like, and then you have a pattern with the underscore and the % sign wildcards, that could be provided. Those wildcards and the pattern that you're using in the like state could be provided by variable substitution. So if that's what you're looking for, yes, absolutely.
And
otherwise,
and you mentioned how to put characters in by just duplicating the character, right? If you need a curly brace or whatever,
yes,
then put two curly braces, for example.
Exactly. And if you want to actually search for an ampersand, you proceed by an ampersand. I was using the term the and character instead of ampersand, but that's just that was just during that recording. I called it an and character right at the beginning, and then I thought, I'll just keep that up for the rest of the talk. But any case, yeah, that's so you can use wildcards in your expressions just like you would in a traditional SQL statement.
Yep.
But otherwise, I'm not sure if there's something, Robert, if you want to follow up with that, I'll be more than happy to try to answer more clearly.
Okay. And Richard's asking, I guess this is about FireDAC and MS Access. Apparently, he's saying he needs admin rights to do any kind of processing on 32-bit Windows app. Yeah,
so this is not uncommon. Let's say that I wanted to use for some reason, for historical reasons, my application has to talk to paradox tables. In that case, what I'm going to need to do is use the ODBC driver and the paradox driver that is provided with ODBC. In order to do that, I'm going to need administrative privileges. So what I do with an application like that is we set up and say run as with administrative rights. So we just go in to the icon representing that executable, right-click, select properties, and then go to the, I think it's the compatibility page and say run with administrative privileges. Now, you are going to get that the UAC confirmation when you run that application. They'll say, are you sure you want to allow this application to make changes? But you will need those privileges in order to access those I think it's in order to access the 32-bit ODBC driver. And it could be because of the location of the driver. But that's not uncommon. I know that the examples that I've created that have to talk to paradox tables have had to have administrative rights. So I'm not surprised that Microsoft Access would have a similar requirement.
Yeah, and I put the link to the FireDAC DocWiki page on Microsoft Access because there's a couple external links to Microsoft sites that are on that page for additional details. So.
No, that's good.
Yeah. Vladislav is asking, do you have any examples in your CDS book for C++?
No, I don't, and I apologize for that. I'm not a C++ developer. That's one thing that I just there's all these great technologies out there, and unfortunately, C++ is one that I have I've never bothered to, and that's really it's just my fault. But there's other things I've put my time into, and I just have never done it with C++. I apologize. If anyone is really motivated and wants to translate the examples that I have created to C++, I'd be more than happy to post them on the site, although the book is very Delphi-centric, the ClientDataSet book, that is.
Yep. I'm putting the link. I'm just going to double check to make sure I typed it in right. Okay, that's the link. There's the link to the zip file. And then the other one is just delphideveloperdays.com. But the links are sitting there on the screen, so you could always capture the screen using Snip Tool or whatever platform you're on.
And if Kai is actually asking about links to this question log, these questions and answers, I think, David, you brought this up in this morning's sessions, that what you can do is from the webinar little application that is here, you can select File, Save Questions Log, or File, Save Chat Log, so you can you can save these questions that they're right from your computer now.
Yeah, I took it that he wanted the links that are on the screen right now. So, but that's just me. You know, what do I know? Let's see. Let me put this one in Delphi. Developer.com. There's the other one. And if you just go to JensenDataSystems.com, there's links to books, developer days on the homepage of JensenDataSystems.com. I think you can type that in. Okay.
And I see Richard has posted saying Delphi Developer Days 2015 in Chicago. Wouldn't miss it for anything. See you there. If you're interested in going to Chicago, we're still a couple months off, but I have to tell you, we are going to sell out Chicago. I think we may have 6 seats left. So it's going to be a great event. I'm so looking forward to it. We have people coming from all over the Americas, South America as well, and North America. So it's going to be a really great group. We do limit the size of these events, and in Chicago we're going to have 40. I think it's going to be 45 total, and there's only 6 seats left. So if you want to go to Chicago, and you know the interesting thing about that, there's only one person signed up from Illinois for the Chicago event. Everyone else is flying in.
Everybody wants to get. It's too cold in Chicago. Everybody wants to go somewhere. I don't know. I have a daughter in graduate school in the suburb of Chicago at Northwestern University. So let's see. So Hugo's asking a question. I don't know if you see it, Cary. When you use third-party library, I don't know what third-party library, using scripts with macros require additional query. With FireDAC, can we use macros as we do params? I mean, use macro by name before executing.
Yes, you can use, I don't think it's macro by name, but it's, you can reference a macro by the name of the macro, and you can programmatically discover the names of the macros by iterating through the macros collection property. So I hope that helps. Also, the macros, just like params, have type. And so there's a form of metadata concerning the macros, so you can see if this is most of the strings that I've seen are all raw data type, but there are several different types of macro types, so that if you had to do a conversion for an integer to a string or something like that, you would be able to do that, and again, programmatically discover this information.
Yeah, and I put a couple links for FireDAC macro. There's the convert macro function, and then there's the system macro function. So I put those 2 links in the Q&A log. And then you can also go up to the preprocessing command text homepage, and there's date and time macros, numeric macros, character macros. Here, I'll put that one. Here's the last one that has links to do all of that stuff. That's in the Q&A log. So just you can search FireDAC DocWiki macros in Google, and you'll find things. Let's see. Come to Boston sometime, John says.
Oh, I love Boston and have done quite a bit of training there. We have a difficulty with Delphi Developer Days in that we, me and my co-presenters, Bob Swartz was a co-presenter for the past 2 years. He's still involved in Delphi Developer Days, but he's taking a sabbatical from travel for this first half of the year. And we are so lucky to have the great Ray Konopka joining us for this year's event. But we do have limited time, so we try to pick cities that are easy to get to, that once you're at the airport, you can take a shuttle, free shuttle from the airport to the hotel, or at least have very convenient public transportation. And the difficulty with, I'd love to do Boston. It's just kind of like right on the edge of the country in the upper edge, and we've done a lot of surveys over the years trying to ask people where should we go, and so that drives the decision-making process quite a bit.
Also, right now, you don't want to be in Boston. There's too much. There's so much. I don't know where to do it. I think there was a news article about someone was selling the snow and shipping it to somewhere else. But anyway, let's see. Everybody's got their favorite city. So, okay. Dallas.
That's right.
Dallas is
great
to where Cary is in Houston. So.
That's right. Dallas is close, and we have considered Dallas. It's a huge airport there.
Easy.
And it's central to the United States. So no matter where you're coming from, the worst case scenario is you have a 3.5-hour flight. We have considered that. Maybe we will do it sometime.
Yeah.
I see someone has asked a question about Delphi in depth. They currently own it. The second edition has some updates and some. I removed 3 chapters on DataSnap from the book because I thought they were just a little bit out of place. The biggest thing I did for the second edition is I rewrote all the examples using InterBase and FireDAC, but the paradox examples still work. If you own the original edition and you have Delphi XE5 and later, go to the code page for the original book, and you'll see a new link there for the InterBase and FireDAC samples. Of course, your book has paradox code samples directly in the pages, but I rewrote everything and have duplicate projects using the FireDAC and InterBase. So, but you do need XE5 and later for that. And if you don't have XE5 and you have the second edition, you're still working with, say, XE2, you'll probably want to use the paradox examples because they'll work right out of the box.
And I put the link to that landing page for the CDS book in the Q&A log, and if you scroll down, you'll see download CDS code paradox and CDS code InterBase, sort of the sample code to accompany the book. So you'll see those 2 links with the words download highlighted for paradox and InterBase. So you just have to scroll down. It's in the lower 40% of the page. You can also download the table of contents and the forward and introduction. There are links for that as well. Okay, Cary, thank you very much. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Okay, Alan's asking, have you had any issues migrating an EDAC project? I guess this is for us. I'm getting access violations with clone cursors for some reason.
Clone cursors. So it looks like that Alan has migrated from any DAC to FireDAC. I haven't had problems with clone cursors, but I will say this, and it kind of depends what you're using. And I hope that I'm not wrong at this, but because I've asked some questions from Dimitri about the clone cursors. Clone cursors work with the FireDAC memtable, FDMMTable, but the clone cursor method was introduced in the FDDB dataset or something like that, a really rather high level ancestor of the T datasets in FireDAC, but it is really not supported in the FD query, FD stored proc, and FD table. At least that's my understanding, that the clone cursors are really intended for FDMMTables, even though that method appears in the other data sets. So if that's where you're encountering the problem, Alan, that could very well be it. That's true. The answer that David has typed in there, Dimitri does answer questions, and his knowledge of FireDAC, having had written it, is just phenomenal. His knowledge of databases in general is unparalleled. So it's just, he's done just such a wonderful job with FireDAC.
80 memtables.
Okay, I see Alan's 80 memtables. Yeah. Yeah. Why don't you post some examples that are causing you trouble, and Dimitri will respond to that hopefully in a timely manner. Because I haven't seen. I have done some clone cursors. In fact, I wrote my last article for Blaise Pascal magazine was on using clone cursors with FDMMTables, and I haven't run into any kind of access violation when I've been doing that.
Okay, so Nicholas says, loving these demos. For the parameterized query demo, would it be possible to trigger a method that would read the defs for the fields being selected and change the column width automatically?
Well, yes, we certainly could do something like that, but there's nothing built in. You'd have to create that yourself, and you'd have to be pretty clever about it so that you would recognize that you want to have integer fields a certain width. You'd probably want to take into account the caption of the length of the caption of the column also. And I think he's probably referring to specifically using a grid with live bindings, as those grids just adopt a common width for every grid or every column in the grid has the same width. But you certainly could do something with reading metadata and coming up with a mechanism for automatically adjusting the widths of your columns. It is something that you would then have to manually invoke from your code, but I don't see any limitations there.
Yeah, and at design time, you can right mouse click. Once you have the grid and you live bind it, you can then say, bring up the column editor, and it'll create an additional object that is bound, and you can go and fiddle with each of the columns. But if, Nicholas, if what you're trying to do is look at what the data you have is and resize, sort of like Excel, you can select a range of rows and columns and then double click on the border, and it'll size them to the longest that it finds along the way. But otherwise, you could use the metadata that would say, well, you wouldn't, if it was a blob, you wouldn't know, you'd have to read. But if it was varchar 20, then it's max 20, and you could set the width to that. Yeah. Let's see. Neville's saying, great skill sprint, concise and clear, very useful information, good demos, good audio quality. Love to hear more from Cary. Excellent. Alan I is saying, Cary, I read a paper you wrote in 1989 on disconnected data sets, and it set the ground for a very successful 20 years. I'm now waiting for FireDAC to be opened up to other database vendors so we can switch to FireDAC. Once again, listening very carefully. Alan, I'm not sure. Oh, I see. FireDAC meaning drivers for other databases besides FireDAC or going through ODBC. Is that what you're meaning there, Alan, that you want to get to some other ones? I think the most recent one we added or are going to add is Teradata support with FireDAC. But if there's other databases, pass those along to Dimitri. Go into the news groups for FireDAC, both in the new community and the old news group, and tell him what's the database that you want that does SQL and all sorts of other stuff. Otherwise, ODBC is there for sure. Nicholas was saying, yeah, it was the grid column widths referring to. I wondered if there was an event during pre-processing he could hook in order to find what metadata I need to access. I mean, you could hook some kind of an on connect or on
open. I would say after open of a data set, and this would work with any T data set, you could do on an after open, because now once it's open, you do have the metadata available to you. So that would be the event handler I would hook to.
I think one thing you showed in a previous time, I think it was you, maybe it was the local SQL talk about you can have a select statement where the where clause is always false, like where 1 equals 0, it'll never be true, and then you get all the metadata, and you don't have to fetch any rows, right?
Yeah, that's what I did in this. That was in this presentation, in fact. But that's just one technique.
Sure.
Another technique is if you're using something like a client data set and extracting data, you could set packet records to 0, and then what happens is it just fetches metadata, and then you can go through the T fields just like you would normally, and you would look at the data type and the size of the fields for strings. If it would be, every string field is going to have a size. For decimal fields, you'll have a size and precision. So you certainly could use that kind of information. And the after open is where you would get that.